and and let me put everybody on mute. Um, so the question that was asked, we were talking schmoozing a little bit before we started with class this morning about the portion Mishpatim, was about one of the attorneys representing Donald Trump in the impeachment trial, David Schoen, who is a modern Orthodox Jew, and the question was about why he put his hand on his head when he drank some water yesterday during the trial. So I was talking about there are many modern Orthodox Jews who work for the government or work in business or whatever when you go to work with a whole variety of people, that there is the custom not for many Orthodox Jews not to wear a kippah in public, just for the sake of business, whatever it is. So in my business, it's okay to wear a kippah all the time. But I could understand if you work for the government or work for a law office or whatever, you might feel uncomfortable having a public display of your religion that way, perhaps making clients ill at ease, whatever. So the discussion was about covering your head, and it all gets to the question about the place of law when it comes to spirituality. It's one thing for law and everyone agreeing, of course, that we need law to govern society. We need laws, regulations, standards, etc., in order to keep the peace within society and to ensure that the just, fair, equitable treatment of everyone in society. No one disagrees with that, and that's just a basic element of how society works. And philosophers of society over the ages, over the millennia, all agree that you need law to keep the peace. The question is complicated or nuanced when it comes to Jewish law, because not only is Judaism a civilization, in other words, we are a people that have a country, we have a homeland, and we have laws that govern our society, but we are also a religion. So what does law have to do with religion? So our laws are much more significant than Muslim law, the Sharia law, as it's called, I believe, that governs Islamic society. It is technical and governs a lot of their society, but it's not quite as complex and thorough as Jewish law is. I mean, you pull down, you can have a set of Talmud on your shelf that almost equals all the shelves in a law office library or conference room about all the statutes there, right? So it's Talmudic law, and then the Shulchan Aruch 500 years later, summary of Jewish law, and all the other legal law books would be equal to the statutes books that lawyers would have on their shelves. And so what does this have to do with spirituality? So that's where this portion, Mishpatim, one element of this portion comes to play. So let me just say the bracha of the Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So last week we had the 10 commandments that serve as the foundational principles for an ethical, moral, and religious society. Mishpatim, which begins on page 456 in the Eitz Chaim, chapter 21 of the book of Exodus, whatever Chumash you're using, lays out some of the deeper principles of what civil law is, how the 10 commandments come to play in major ways that people in society relate with each other. And so some have questioned, well, let me put it this way. Judaism has always been a legal society, has always been, up until the 1800s, when you define yourself as a Jew, you define yourself in relationship to your community and the rabbi who is in charge of your community. There are no options before the 1800s of choices within Judaism. It's just Judaism. There's no such thing as Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Ultra-Orthodox, New Age, Reconstructionist, nothing like that before the 1800s. It's just Judaism, which is based, again, on rabbis continuing to interpret Jewish law for the sake of the society. It's only in the 1800s where choices come to play within the Jewish community, because Jews were allowed out of the ghetto and were made citizens of France and then citizens of Germany. So Jews didn't have to define themselves by the community in which they live. They could define themselves as citizens of France or citizens of Germany. And so that brought choice to how Jews could understand what it means to be Jewish. And the Reform Judaism said we don't need law to define our spirituality. We just need the ethical and moral principles that the Torah and the Bible and what has been taught throughout the ages has left our society with. That's all we need. And Orthodox Judaism was established in response to Reform Judaism to say, no, we need law to govern still need law to govern our lives today. We could still be a full member of French society or German society while also observing Jewish law. Like you could be the lawyer for Donald Trump, Orthodox Judaism can say, and you don't need the kippah on your head, because wearing a kippah is just a custom. It's not Jewish law. When you put a kippah on in the morning, there's no bracha you say when you put on the kippah. Unlike the bracha you say when you put on a talit, whether it's the undergarment talit or the overgarment talit that we wear during services. You say a bracha for that, so that means it's a mitzvah. No bracha for putting on a kippah, it's just custom, because the Talmud says you shouldn't walk outside your home for 4 cubits without your head covered, in recognition that God is above us. That's all, just a custom. So you don't need, it's not halacha to have to wear it. There are some elements about defining what the size of a kippah should be and how extensive your head should be covered if you're going to follow that custom of covering your head, but it's not halacha. So the idea is, again, for these laws, and why we have these laws anyway in the Torah, and then the whole system of Jewish law, the Mishnah, the Gemara, and everything else about rabbinic law over the centuries, is all about providing us with moments of spirituality that we can have during the day. So if we didn't have Jewish law, our opportunities for engagement with God or feeling, no, Arnie, it's never a halacha. It's never a requirement to wear a kippah. It's just a custom. It's a long-standing custom, but it's not halacha. It's absolutely not required to have it. It almost has the requirement of covering your head, but it's not quite. So, the stash of yarmulkes that you have in a drawer or in a closet at home, you can throw them away, because God's name is not written on a kippah. There's nothing holy about it. And so it's just a custom that has been part of Jewish tradition for 1,000 or so years, which gives it much weight. And we all think we need to wear a kippah, but you don't have to wear a kippah, like you have to wear a talit when you pray. You have to wear tefillin when you pray on a weekday morning, and other have tos that are part of our tradition. So I understand Jewish law as a conservative Jew. An Orthodox Jew would say the same thing. Any denomination in Judaism that says Jewish law is required to be observed to define yourself as a Jew today, everyone sees Jewish law as an opportunity for engagement with God. So in other words, when I wear a kippah, when I put on a talit, when I say a blessing, all the Jewish things that I do over the course of the day, if any of us do it appropriately, we're supposed to take a moment and think about what we're doing. And as we're thinking about it, it's an opportunity then to connect to our identity as a Jew, to connect to God in the universe, and to recognize our relationship with God. That's what Jewish law is about. It's not to restrict our behavior in any way. It's not to limit our lives or put limits on our lives. It's not meant to be seen as a negative. Even though people make fun of all of the details of Jewish law, and if you study or even just look at the page of Talmud for whatever day it is, like the page of Talmud today is all about, and it continues a discussion about ritual purity as in relationship to offering the Passover sacrifice. So it's going into excruciating detail about that, and you wonder as you read it, what is spiritual about this at all? And you have to take a moment and say, it's all about trying to understand God's law as written in the Torah and how we can observe God's law. So that's where Mishpatim comes into play, and that's where the rest of the body of Jewish law comes into play as well. Any questions or comments about that before we get into the portion? Yes, Sylvia, unmute yourself. Go ahead.
I think there are 17 of us right now watching, and I'm just curious, do 16 other people, are they as surprised as I am at what you just taught us?
About a kippah?
About a kippah.
Yeah. Whenever I teach the kids about it in religious school or anybody else, yes, people are shocked. People think that this is like a basic thing that all Jews do. You have to cover your head. Well, you don't have to, in the same sense as when you start Shabbat, you have to light the Shabbos candles. When you eat, you have to keep kosher. I'm doing all of this in air quotes because I don't want to be judging anybody here or anybody watching about their lifestyle. But in the scheme of things, keeping kosher, lighting Shabbos candles, those are have to kinds of things. Kippah is not a have to. It's just a real, it's a long-standing tradition, so that when we're back in the building and people come into the building, people of all stripes and colors, yes, it would be appropriate for the greeter and the usher to be offering a kippah to people to be putting on. So yes, that's I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing that. I'm just saying that in the scheme of things, in understanding Jewish practice, there are those practices that are considered a custom, even though it's a long-standing custom, it's still a custom. Minhag is the word in Hebrew. And then there are those practices that are Jewish law, halacha, that can't be or are very difficult to overturn. So yes, so it's just, if I'm not saying anything radical, Sylvia, so don't worry. I'm never going to advocate that we shouldn't pray without a kippah, that we should pray without a kippah, or that we should disposable kippah. Yeah, if you go to the Kotel in Jerusalem, that's what you get. If you're not wearing a kippah, if you're going to the men's section, you got these ridiculous looking paper things, cardboard things that you're handed to put on your head. Yes, of course, that's a disposable kippah, but it serves the purpose. That's just as that fulfills the so-called obligation, the tradition, the custom to cover your head when going to a holy place. So yes, so even though it's ridiculous, you never want to keep it afterwards as a keepsake. And if you tried, you ruin it, right? You put it in your pocket, you can't put it on your head again. So a little bit of rain falling, it will disintegrate on your head as well. So yes, there are these disposable kippot, and that's, yeah, when the funeral home gives you a kippah, God forbid, at a funeral, when shuls give out the black or white ones, they're meant to be disposable. You don't have to, I mean, you could keep it in your glove compartment or keep it in a drawer and or keep it in your tallis bag so that you have it the next time you come. But it's nicer to have a kippah like this or something else that is a little bit more decorative, meaningful, etc. But again, it's all in the fulfillment of a custom, not in the fulfillment of halacha. Okay, so let's look at, wait, there's somebody with a, yes, Danny Ben, go ahead.
Right. So you said we can dispose of the kippah, right? You can.
Yes, you can throw it away.
What about a talit?
No. I said kippah. I didn't say talit.
A talit you got to bury, right?
Right. A talit you have to bury because a talit is made in a holy way. The tzitzit that are on the talit make the talit a holy garment and not just a regular garment that we're wearing. And you say a blessing when you put a talit on, and some talitot have the blessing written on the neck piece of the talit. You don't have to have the bracha written on it. It could be any kind of decoration, and the fabric could be anything as long as it's a big enough size and it has 4 corners on it on which to put the tzitzit. So a talit is kosher if it has the tzitzit tied to each corner. If the talit doesn't have tzitzit on it, it's not kosher anymore. But it should still be buried if it at one time was a kosher talit. Yes, Jane.
I thought when the tzitzit are tied correctly, and it's like the certain number of wines, and then the knot, and then the certain number of wines.
Right.
Doesn't that actually stand for a yud and a hey and a vav and a hey? No, and so therefore it's kind of like having God's name on it, and so therefore it would have to be buried in the Geniza and not just like tossed away like your grocery shopping list.
That's absolutely true. That the tzitzit are tied in a way to remind us of 2 words: Adonai Echad, one God. Okay, so there are 5. Very quickly. There are 613 commandments. The word every Hebrew letter has a numerical equivalent. The word tzitzit, when spelled out, Sadi Yud Tuf, equals 600. Sadi 90, Yud 10. 90, 10, 90, 10. Tuf is 400. 90, 10, 90, 10, 400 equals 600. So 613 commandments, you need 13 more to get the number 613 for the tallis to represent that. So you have 5 knots on each tzitzit, 5 knots. You take a look at it afterwards, take my word for it. 5 knots and 8 strings. It's really 4 strings, but they're doubled over. So you have 8 strings, 5 knots, 8 and 5, 13, plus the word tzitzit equaling 600. So tzitzit represents 613 commandments. So we wear the talit to remind us of the commandments. We wear the talit to remind us of our relationship to God. In between the 5 knots, 1 string is longer than the other strings. That's a shamash string. That 1 string gets wrapped around the other strings 7 times between the first 2 knots, 8 times between the next 2, 11 times between the next 2, and 13 times between the next 2. 7, 8, 11 adds up to 26, right? 7 plus 8 plus 11 is 26. Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, 10, 5, 6, 5 adds up to 26. And then 13, you're left with the last one. So 7, 8, 11, the first 3 sets of tying around is Adonai. The last one, Echad, Aleph, Chet, Daled, 1, 8, 4 adds up to 13. So 7, 8, 11, Adonai, 13, Echad, Adonai Echad. That's what the tzitzit represents. Okay, so that's a quick lesson about why the tzitzit are tied the way they are, and to add to the holiness of the garment themselves. The rabbis themselves came up with that idea of how to tie the tzitzit. The Torah says to have tzitzit on the garment. It doesn't tell us how to tie the tzitzit. Torah tells us to bind it for a sign upon our hands and a sign between our eyes. Tefillin doesn't tell us how to make the tefillin. We know that tefillin, the way we make tefillin today, are the same that they have been made for 1,800 years, because they found a pair of tefillin from the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt 1,900 years ago in the land of Israel. And the tefillin there, because Israel's a dry climate, the leather did not disintegrate. They examine that tefillin and find that it's made exactly the same way, with the parchment inside the boxes with the exact same paragraphs on them as we have them today. So we know tefillin are around for 1,900 years. We assume that tzitzit are tied the way they are for that same amount of time too. All of this gets to the point of why we need this. Why do we need these laws? If the Torah says you have tzitzit on, who cares what kind of tzitzit? I could have tzitzit my way. You can have tzitzit your way. Each one of you could tie tzitzit. It wouldn't be standard or uniform for everybody, as long as we have something that looks like tzitzit. It also says to have a blue string. Doesn't matter what shade of blue it is. My blue, your blue, somebody else's blue. What difference? There's so many different shades of blue. And in the health and science section yesterday in the paper, there's a whole new shade of blue out there that they made in a factory. What is it? Yin Min blue, something like that. Look it up. It's some like technical name for this new blue dye that they found. But no, the rabbis said we want to come together as community, all doing the same thing in the exact same way. So we're going to have the exact same shade of blue on everybody's tzitzit made in the particular way. The purple dye that was found, I looked that up, that was just discovered in Israel 2 weeks ago. That purple dye is made from the same sea creature that the blue dye comes from. And they found this purple dye. Just Google purple dye times of Israel, and you'll see a beautiful picture of this piece of fabric that's 2,000 years old that they found in the land of Israel. Beautiful shade of blue there, light purple. A shade of light purple. And made from the same sea creature that the blue dye comes from, very expensive dye. And tying the tzitzit in a particular way also helps bring us together. So law unifies society, and law then, so how often when we put on a talis do we actually take the time to look at the tzitzit and remind ourselves this stands for Adonai Echad, and we're connecting with God. There are people, I'm not one of them because I didn't grow up this way, and I just didn't become, it has not become part of my habit. There are people, when they put on a talit, will cover their head with the talit first as they say the blessing. And there are a few verses, if you look in any edition of a prayer book, it'll have for putting on a talit. If somebody was trying to get in. For putting on a talit, a couple of verses to help meditate or focus our attention. I've never gotten in the habit of doing it, but it helps us focus on the spirituality of fulfilling the law of wearing tzitzit. And the same thing with putting on tefillin. There is like a kavana, an intention that we say. So in the edition of the Haggadah that I use, called A Different Night, published by the Hartman Institute, every blessing that we say in the Haggadah is introduced with a Hineni Muchan Umezuman statement. Here I am, ready and willing and about to fulfill this mitzvah, which is the mitzvah of the first cup of wine, the second cup of wine, eating matzah, eating maror, eating the charoset, whatever the mitzvah is. There's a Hineni Muchan Umezuman, a behold, I am ready to do this. So there is that tradition before reciting a bracha to do this meditative statement first, this kavana first. So it's all about taking the extra steps of making law spiritual, but it also leads to the debate that still rages in ultra-Orthodox circles in the Jewish community between the Lithuanians, the Litvaks, and the Hasidim. So there were the Hasidim and there were the Misnagdim, if you pronounce it in the Ashkenazi way. The Hasidim and those who are opposed to, mitnaged is to be opposed to, mitnagdim are those who are opposed to. The Hasidim and the mitnagdim. The mitnagdim were the people who are in the yeshiva all day talking like this and shuckling back and forth and studying and observing the law to the letter. The Hasidim did that, but they also danced and sang and had joy with observing the commandments. So the revolution of the Hasidic community was to add more spirit and joy to the observance of the commandments. So even though they look alike today with the black coats and black hats, and you can't tell the difference between a Hasidic rabbi and a mitnaged rabbi, because they all look alike today in how they dress, their style of davening would be different. And in a mitnagdish synagogue or yeshiva, you'd be going through pretty quick. In a Hasidic yeshiva, you'd take your time with the silent prayer, and you'd also take extra time with singing the prayers as well. So it all depends on how we try to make law spiritual. There are places that the thing to do in Jerusalem is to go to a different shul every Friday night for Kabbalat Shabbat, for welcoming Shabbat. And there are places where it could take 4 hours to do the Friday night service. The Friday night service that we do in 45 minutes could be done in some Hasidic places in 4 hours, taking extra time, singing and meditating on every single word in the service. So that's not my cup of tea. That's not what I'm looking for in a service. I'm looking for singing in a service, but not to spend 4 hours in it. But for some people, that's what it's all about. What's the justification for ultra-Orthodox Jews wearing the black garb that they wear? The simple answer, Gabe, as a non-Chassid, non-ultra-Orthodox Jew, is that it's based on the garb of Polish nobility from the 1600s. And so it calls into question their whole idea of being Torah true Jews, right? That's their mantra, that we are Torah true Jews, the ultra-Orthodox say. Well, not so much, because they're wearing what Polish nobility wore in the 1600s. So how is that Torah true? Again, as an outsider and a critic of ultra-Orthodox lifestyle, I can say that. How an ultra-Orthodox Jew would answer your question? They would say it's the height of modesty, that Jewish men need to wear black and white. That's it. No colors. Colors are arrogant. Colors are vain. I remember this. Lenore has relatives who live in Lakewood, New Jersey. First cousin of hers and their children. One of their daughters got married a few years ago. We were invited to the wedding. The invitation came with an insert telling us how to dress for this wedding, and that we shouldn't wear, women should not wear red at all. That's a sign of bad luck. There will be separate entrances to the wedding hall for men and for women. Men are encouraged to wear white shirts, black suits. Just so it's all about a sense of modesty, not just the uniformity, but the sense of modesty. This is a way of showing respect to God. Okay, so that 33-minute introduction to our portion That's okay. I love this kind of thing. Let's take a look at the below the line on page 456 to see what our commentary has to say about the role of the portion Mishpatim and the rest of Jewish law that we'll come across in the Torah. The rules. So I'm on the below the line on the left hand side of page 456. The rules of forming a just society outlined at the beginning of this portion follow the discussion about the design of the altar at the end of the previous one, right? So chapter 20 ends with the 10 commandments, and after the 10 commandments, Moses builds an altar on Mount Sinai, and a sacrifice was offered at that time. In time to come, the Midrash says, when there will no longer be an altar, building a just society will be the equivalent of bringing sacrifices. So this is a nice Midrash, and the collection of Midrash is called Yalkut Shimoni. That's where this is taken from. Says, okay, we have the temple in Jerusalem. The temple in Jerusalem is the place of sacrifices and offerings. It's a central shrine of worship. When that temple is destroyed, we have law and prayer to take its place. So by having the altar in chapter 20 right next to laws in chapter 21 provides for the rabbis this lesson of law replacing sacrifice. So it goes on, the laws of the Torah are not given in the names of kings or even in the name of Moses. They are religious and moral instructions given by God. Obeying the laws creates not only a harmonious society, but a just and holy one. So that just takes it one more level than I was saying before. We need law to keep society just. It's also harmonious, but also law elevates society to a holy society. That's by observing the law, we're not only doing the right thing, we're doing the sacred thing. Okay, so it's an opportunity for us to experience God and for us to elevate our lives in a sacred way. Violations of laws, this continues, are seen as offenses against God, not just against the violated person, right? So that's another thing. So I'm picking on Dennis now because Dennis is right next to me on my screen. If I did something against Dennis, I'd have to make amends with Dennis. But it's not just doing something wrong to Dennis, it's doing something wrong to God. Okay, so these laws that govern our relationship with our fellow human beings also reflect how we relate to God. Because if we can respect our fellow human being, who is also created in the image of God, just like we are, then if we can respect them, then we are respecting God. Unlike the secular legal traditions of other societies, the laws of the Torah are cited not as the products of human wisdom and experience, but as a reflection of divine principles built into the world. Thus, the dignity of a human being is as much a permanent part of God's creation as the law of gravity. But there's a statement here. The laws of the Torah are cited not as the products of human wisdom and experience, but as a reflection of divine principles built into the world. Okay, so this gets to the heart of interpretation of Jewish law and whether people in the form of rabbis have the right to interpret law as written in the Torah. Because the rabbis say the Torah was given by God directly to Moses. God spoke the law, God wrote it down, and then God handed it to Moses. But the rabbis also say that rabbis have the right to interpret the law today. So they straddle, no, they walk a fine line in recognizing that the law is divine in origin, And at the same time, human beings, rabbis, have the right to interpret those divinely created laws. All right, we'll get to that in a moment after we finish this commentary. We'll get to that when we look at in a few pages, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth law. So outside of Israel, the commentary goes on, outside of Israel, you would have to go to 3 different addresses to get the material that's contained in the portion Mishpatim. The Torah combines law, as in the Code of Hammurabi, an ancient Sumerian code of law that is 3,000 years old or more. Cultic instructions, as from a priestly manual, right? The book of Leviticus tells us how to offer sacrifices. Mishpatim tells us how to relate to our fellow human beings. 2 different kinds of law. And moral exhortation, as found in wisdom literature. Be holy. Do this in order to be holy. That kind of thing is found in so-called wisdom literature. This is the only Near Eastern literature in which an amalgam of these 3 interests is found: law, cult, and wisdom. So in other words, the Torah contains it all, as opposed to saying that we have to find this in 3 different places. Judaism is based not only on the major pronouncements of the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, but on the hundreds of minor ways in which we are called on to sanctify our relationships with other people. Ramban, that's Nachmanides, who lived about 800 years ago in Spain, sees this portion as an extension of the 10th commandments. You shall not covet. To obey that commandment properly, we need to know what we are entitled to and what belongs to our neighbor. All right, so he's seeing the transition from the last commandment, do not covet, to all these laws defining how we should not be coveting. Okay, our standards of how we treat others must be based not on social utilitarian concerns, the desire for an orderly society, but on the recognition of the image of God in every person and the presence of God in every relationship. So as I keep on saying, purpose of observing law and following the law is to see the divine in every human being and in everything we do. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about this. I wanted to get now back to this idea that the rabbis have the right to interpret these laws. If we turn ahead to page 462, so here we find, just a second, let me put this in context. Let's start with verse 22 on page 461. So it's Exodus chapter 21, verse 22, page 461 in the Eitz Chaim. When men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Okay, so straight reading of this is that, I'll take Dennis as my example again. If I were to gouge out Dennis's eye, then he would have the right to gouge out my eye as punishment. Or the court would gouge out my eye in punishment. If I punch him in the mouth and break his teeth, then he would have the right to punch me in the mouth and break my teeth. That's what it seems like from this portion, right? If other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. And in Islamic law today, and in some Arab countries that are ruled by Islamic law, yes, they do chop off people's hands as punishment for a law that they violate. So, and crimes they commit. So it's still done today. Jewish law, though, has never done this. And there's extensive conversation in the Talmud about how exactly we are to understand eye for eye, tooth for tooth. So let's look below the line at number 24, the bottom of the left-hand column onto the right-hand column. The passage concerning an eye for an eye is one of the best known and most misunderstood in the entire Bible. The sages deduced that an eye for an eye does not mean that one lost an eye for injuring another's eye. Why? Because one person's eye may be more valuable in his work than another's, and intentional maiming is not the same as accidental injury, right? So if one person needs their eye more than another person to do the work that they do, then that person's eye is more valuable than the other person's eye. If somebody's hands are more valuable than, right, a concert pianist's hands, if you injure a concert pianist's hands, they're out of a job and they're out of livelihood. Whereas somebody else, yes, we all need our hands, but a non-concert pianist's hands are not as valuable as so that's the rabbis understand this and say that it's not fair to do an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, burn for burn, etc., because it's just not equivalent value. Instead, the commentary continues, one paid to the injured party the value of that eye in monetary compensation. So you'd figure out the value that person's eye has to that person based on how old they are, based on whether they only have one eye or two eyes, and on the type of work they're doing, all goes into valuing the eye. And then coming up with a monetary equivalent that then the injurer needs to pay the injured. Okay? So Ibn Ezra endorses this interpretation. And so it's not a direct word for word interpretation. Eye for eye, tooth for a tooth. We think if God said this, we have to observe it literally. The rabbis say, no, absolutely not. It's always understood as monetary compensation. So Ibn Ezra endorses this interpretation. If we do not trust the sages' interpretation, we will be unable to understand the Torah's demands, Ibn Ezra says. So in other words, we need the rabbis to interpret it this way in order for us to make sense of how we're supposed to, because otherwise we'd be chopping people's hands off and we'd be gouging people's eyes out and we'd be breaking people's teeth. So you'd have a lot of injured people walking around, and that just doesn't seem to be the way that God would have wanted society to be run. So the rabbis in coming up with this interpretation and rabbis in subsequent generations endorsing it, this is the official interpretation of this passage. How the rabbis understand it is how we are supposed to understand this passage when we read it. So the whole concept of Torah true Judaism, or living life literally according to the Bible, neither one of those is a true Jewish way of understanding the Torah. It's not Jewish to read the Torah literally. So the Karaite Jews, a segment of the Jewish community today that does not endorse rabbinic Judaism, is not mainstream Judaism. Mainstream Judaism is rabbinic Judaism, which is based on interpretation of the text. And how rabbis interpret it is how we understand it, and that's how we are supposed to observe Judaism today. So when ultra-Orthodox Jews claim that they are Torah true, they are misleading everybody else, because their Torah true, their so-called Torah true, is based on their rabbi's interpretation of the text. Okay, because their Torah true does not endorse eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, literally. The ultra-Orthodox Torah true is also about monetary compensation, and therefore it's misleading to say Torah true. It's rabbinic true, not Torah true. Okay, so the commentary goes on, just as we received the written Torah from our ancestors, so did we receive its oral interpretation. The two are inseparable, right? So when we read Torah, we have to read Torah through the rabbi's eyes in order to understand what we as Jews today are supposed to, how we're supposed to understand the Torah. Right, so it's very important for us to keep that in mind. When we read the Torah today, we're entitled to interpret it any way we want. But in terms of understanding what we're supposed to do with it, in terms of Jewish lifestyle, we have to base it on how the rabbis understood it. And it doesn't mean that we have to maintain how the rabbis understood it. For example, Leviticus chapter 18 tells us prohibits homosexual behavior. And chapter 23 says that one is executed for homosexual behavior. So the rabbis always understood that to be a prohibition of homosexuality. But it doesn't mean that Judaism today is necessarily anti-homosexuality. There's still room within rabbinic tradition and the body of Jewish law to reinterpret that, to say, no, loving relationships is what the Torah endorses, whether it is homosexual or heterosexual. It's monogamous loving relationships that the Torah wants us to have. And so that interpretation, which is not an Orthodox interpretation, Orthodox rabbis are not pro-homosexual. Within the conservative movement since 2006, we have been. And it's all within the framework of Jewish law to allow conservative Judaism today to be pro-homosexuality. Okay, so as long as the framework is there and we work within the framework, then we are true to the rabbinic system. And it allows for a variety of practice, but that's okay because we're all still within the framework of Judaism, right? If somebody within the framework said that it's okay to believe in Jesus as the Messiah, that automatically puts them outside the framework of Judaism. No one within the framework of Judaism has ever said or will ever say that Jesus is the Messiah. That puts us beyond the red line. Who is a Jew, the identification of who is a Jew, has threatened to tear apart the Jewish community when the Reform movement said that a mother or a father could determine the religion of a child. That went against thousands of years of precedent in which only the mother determines the religion of the child. So that was seen as something breaking apart the unity of the Jewish community. Otherwise, all Jews, no matter technically, are Jewish. But when you say that who your parent is could be different, then that threatens Jewish identity and the unity of the Jewish community. So there are certain laws that can be interpreted today in a variety of ways that still maintain us within the system, and certain laws that if you interpret them in the wrong way, put you outside the system. Okay, so that, any questions or comments you have? Okay, so let's stop here for today then. I just wanted to look at least at those two sections of this portion today. And I hope everybody has a safe and healthy day, and good luck in the process of getting your vaccines or getting your second vaccine as well. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.